Our Attorney General has failed to file that lawsuit on the Obama health care legislation. He's failed to engage on the illegal immigration issue. He's declined to get involved in the voter check. That's a bill that just says when you go in to vote, you show an ID. That's all it is. And we'll issue you a free ID if you don't have one. Common sense. You can't go to Walmart and cash a check without them asking you to show ID. It's just legitimate. Make sure you verify who you are, who you say you are. But they want you to be able to vote based upon having a power bill or something that doesn't have, you could pull that out of a mailbox and go vote. And that's not a way to secure your elections. And the reason why that's so important is because you have one vote. You have one vote. And if someone else is fraudulently voting, they are canceling out your one vote. There was a guy that owned down at Lenox Mall. There was a cigar shop down there called the Tinderbox. Y'all may remember it. I don't know if it's still there. It may be. It was there for many, many years. The gentleman that owned the Tinderbox passed away. And years later, his wife went in to vote, and they mentioned to her that her husband had already voted. And she said, well, he already voted, but it must have been 10 years ago because he's been dead for 10 years. And they said, no, he voted earlier today. And they went back and pulled the voting record of the gentleman that owned the Tinderbox. He's just interesting because he was someone that I knew of. He had been voting for 10 years after he died. Now, of course, he wasn't doing that, and it was no fault of his, but somebody was using his identity to vote for 10 years. And the AJC mentioned, is one of the few times they've mentioned some of the voting fraud that's happened in Georgia in that particular instance. There's no reason why we shouldn't have an attorney general that's willing to tell the federal government, we're going to fight so that our citizens' votes are secure. It's a legitimate function of government. But you got to elect someone who's willing to fight and do that for you. Now, I have a little bit of a reputation in the state Senate of being an independent-minded person. And I'm okay with that. I think we've got to elect people that'll stand up and speak their minds and do what they think's right, even if sometimes we disagree with them. When I ran for office in 2002, I pledged to my constituents that I would not vote to expand the size and scope of government, that I would vote to decrease, not increase taxes. I feel like our tax burden is high enough. Government has enough money, and we need to balance budgets on what people can afford to send us with the current tax digest. On 4 occasions, I was asked to raise taxes during the General Assembly. There were 4 different occasions. The most recent one was this year. On all 4 occasions, I said no. All 4 occasions, I had my arm twisted, and I got yelled at a little bit and got threatened a little bit. And this year, they came to me and said, we're trying to balance a budget, and we want to create a new hospital bed tax. It's a tax on hospitals' net revenue. Now, just as an aside, hospitals don't actually pay the tax. They pass it along to the healthcare consumers, the patients. You all, if you go to the hospital, would be the one that pays the tax. But they said, we want to pass this tax in order to balance our budget. And I said, well, I can't help you because I've promised to my constituents that I wouldn't raise taxes. And they said, well, what if we wrap it in a promise of a future tax decrease? I said, no, that's in my view, that's what Washington does. They promise that they're going to do something right now that costs you money, but promise later on it's going to give you a credit or a benefit later that may or may not ever actually happen. I said, I'm not going to vote for a new tax increase. So they voted and passed a tax increase and a big fee increase on a lot of the state fees. And I voted no. And they said, Senator, if you don't vote for this, we're going to take away your chairmanship of one of the most influential committees in the General Assembly, and that's the chairmanship of Judiciary. And I said to them, look, you all do what you need to do, but I'm going to stick with my constituents. They're the ones that voted for me. So I voted no, and they followed through, and they stripped me of my chairmanship of Judiciary that I'd held for 3 terms. And I tell you that story because when I went to the well the next day to speak about it, I spoke to the conservatives and the Republicans and called for them to stick to those conservative values. I respect the people that voted differently. My friends voted differently. I respect those that saw the issue differently than I did. But we cannot allow government to continue where we force everybody to walk in line, do the exact same thing, and don't allow anyone to stand up and speak. I mean, that is what got Washington Republicans in trouble. They went to Washington and they acted just like the Democrats. They ran up deficits. They passed pork barrel spending back home trying to get reelected. And in the end, people said, what's the difference in Republicans and Democrats? So they kicked them out. And now Republicans are arguing to get back in control in Washington because we're in such a mess up there. And they don't have credibility because when they had power in the 2000s, they acted just like the Democrats. Now, I know philosophically they look at things a little differently, but they funded things the same way. In fact, it was worse, to be honest with you. Things have just, every group that gets in is worse every year. They were worse than Democrats before them. The current Democrats are worse than the Republicans were on funding. And we got to stop this. We got to have people that will stand up and say, this is enough. We're going to be different. And here's what happened in Washington. Because of those same arm twisting and threatening and all that kind of stuff that goes on in the back rooms, not a single Republican in Washington stood up and said to their own leadership publicly, this is not the right thing to do. Now, whether they were right or wrong, nobody did it. Nobody stood up and said, we need to do something different. And listen, it's real easy to call out the other party, to criticize Obama, for me to criticize the Democrats. That's easy from a Republican crowd. What's tough is when you have a position of influence and power, and you have to stand up and you feel compelled to defend the people that elected you, even when you know it's going to cost you a great deal. We need an attorney general who's willing to fight for us, who's willing to be independent-minded, and who believes in his heart in conservative values and ideals. And I think that's what you get with me. When I get elected, I will on day one engage in the federal lawsuit to try to overturn this health care bill. The reason is people want to go back to Washington and repeal the bill. I'm all for that, but I'm also realistic. If Congress passed a repeal, Obama will veto the repeal. It's his bill. So even if we took the majority in November, a repeal will not be signed. But the key to turning this back is if you can beat them in the courts will remand this back to the Congress, and they no longer have the votes to do it again. If you've not noticed, they've lost every single election they've engaged in since the health care vote. Obama's 0 for 4 in big races he's engaged in to try to win the seat. They can't pass the bill again. So we need it back in front of them with an American people that have finally woken up to put pressure on them and to stop this from happening. And I think you can do that through an attorney general that will fight for you. We need to engage on the immigration issue. We need to engage in voter ID. And we really need an attorney general that's willing to look at public corruption, try to look at the budget in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse, and start putting some controls on what's going on so that the tax burden doesn't get pushed off on us. That's the kind of attorney general I pledge to you that I will be. I have some literature that I've passed out. Certainly I'll leave some and some yard signs. We're running a very broad grassroots campaign, and I hope that you'll join me in the campaign. My website is prestonsmith.org. You can sign up and we'll send you information and let you know how you can get plugged in. But I love this state. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I know that this process will ultimately, hopefully, bring about the best candidate, and I hope that I can be that candidate for you.